The World Chess Championship Round 1. With the white pieces, we have the youngest ever competitor to the throne, Gukesh, and with the black side, the defending champion, Ding Liren. Let's go ahead and analyze this one. It began with a French defense with knight c3, and we get the typical expansion for white with the French, where you have pawns on c3, d4, e5, and f4. Meanwhile, black is trying to crack through towards the queen side. Now, a lot of moves of theory are played very quickly from both players, developing their pieces, but then something a little bit strange happens. In this moment, Gukesh decides, let's go ahead, a little bit crazy, let's strike already g4. This is already part of his theory. Look at how much time he's spending. He's playing g4 in 20 seconds. So he's definitely comfortable in this position. And what is g4? Well, you're obviously expanding very aggressively on the king side. You are looking eventually to strike with f5, open up files, begin to attack the king. The idea is clear, but so is the drawback. You are abandoning the queen side, or at least you're not focusing there. So I'll give some context. One of the typical ways to continue, I mean, this position is super rare, but at least the engine suggests, is to take on c5. And the idea is that after knight takes, now you just continue by developing knight g3, and you are kind of stopping black for the moment from putting a lot of pressure on the queen side. Why? Because after queen a5, bishop a2, black would love to play a3 here and begin to chop away at your pawns, but b4 comes, and you've managed to kind of trap black with this fork. Okay, what does this mean? This line seems a little bit kind of strange, but it's not, because look what happens after g4. No longer is black worried about a3 and b4, so they go queen a5, they end up playing a3, and you can't play b4 anymore, so you play b3, but then after takes, you play b4, otherwise the pin here would have been quite obnoxious, the queen moves away, and you take. And for the moment, it seems like white is doing fine. They still have the pressure on the king side, and their queen side has not collapsed. But let's take a look at that queen side just a little bit more closely. Specifically, notice the gaping hole on c4 and the weakened backwards pawn on c3. The weaknesses on the queen side are going to be permanent, and black is going to be able to put slowly some pressure there. Now, another element that I think is interesting to analyze is that the attack that white is brewing up here obviously is using initiative. It requires some major pieces. So white, Gukesh, wants to keep the queens on the board. Meanwhile, the weaknesses here on the queen side are going to stay forever. And in fact, black wants to trade the queens to create this backwards pawn that will be able to kind of be a permanent target in an endgame struggle. Okay, so that's kind of the dynamics of the opening. That's how I would characterize what has happened. But okay, both sides are still fairly in the game. There wasn't any major drawback. As I said, g4 was certainly part of Gukesh's theory that he knew, so there isn't anything majorly wrong with it, but practically it gets uncomfortable because look at this. The knight occupies the c4 square, and then the queen occupies the c4 square very soon thereafter, and again, the weaknesses of the light squares, paired with the a2 pawn, paired with the weakness of c3, the backwards pawn, the gaping hole, it's beginning to build a lot of pressure in white's position. Meanwhile, f5 seems very difficult to pull off. So g4, was it actually worth it? It seemed like in this sort of structure, because of the quick pressure that black can put off on the queen side, it's not clear that you're getting the compensation that you require on the king side. Okay, f5. I mean, white has to make something of their g4 push. I will say the engine does prefer rook fe1. They already think, by the way, that this position is uncomfortable to play as white, but their idea is that after queen d3, you're going to go bishop f1, and the bishop kind of reroutes. So you are trading queens in this line, but the bishop finds sort of a more useful diagonal than on g2, and it controls some of these key light squares that were the weaknesses I pointed out. Now, what happened in the game instead is after f5, queen d3 comes, and now you really don't want to trade queens. Like I mentioned, you want the queens for the expansion that you're doing the attack on the king side, but where do you put the queen? Are you really just going to retreat it all the way passively to the bottom of the board? That's exactly what Gukesh does. You can see the engine frowns a little bit. It's a very difficult position to navigate. I mean, the knight is already an absolute monster. The queen is on d3 as early as a couple of moves into the opening, and the attack with f5 just doesn't seem very satisfying. Frankly, it doesn't seem like either player is putting a lot of weight in this attack just based on the fact that black is totally ignoring it and beginning to expand on the queen side and using the weaknesses. And in fact, I think it is these weaknesses that give black the significant advantage that the engine shows. Okay, bishop g5, the bishop is now not trying to get trapped kind of behind the pawns with f6. It's moving out to g5, hitting the rook. There's some juicy squares potentially on this diagonal. The rook moves to safety. But now rook c4. So in the span of like 5 moves, we had a knight, a queen, and a rook sit on this square on c4, which I think illustrates just how weak and vulnerable and accessible that square is, and how scary the move b4, if we back up, how scary this is a move to make, because you're handing your opponent really good real estate right next to all of your pieces, right next to your side of the board. Okay, h4 is played. Let's attack that bishop and hopefully try to force it back to e7, where we can then sacrifice a pawn on f6 in order to finally open up our pieces, give our position a little bit of life. Black is better, but maybe there's some counterplay here. So what does Ding Liren do instead? Well, after h4, he brings the bishop to f4, saying no counterplay to Gukesh. These lines are staying closed. Okay, the queen comes to b1. You're going to lose a pawn. So finally, Gukesh takes his losses and tries to continue with the attack. So c3 hangs, and indeed, Ding Liren is happy to take that pawn off the board. And what Gukesh is saying is, I'm going to try to get some counterplay by taking on e6 and opening up some lines in the end. But this isn't actually as convincing as you might think, because after the simple bishop takes, black is totally in control. We'll take a look at this in a second. What happened in the game was a slight inaccuracy, and it gave Gukesh some chances back to fight. Because here, knight e2 comes, you give away another pawn, but the point is bishop c5, and because the f-file is open, you're going to get some compensation. The queen is coming to f1, mate would then be threatened, and black is still in the driver's seat. They can still defend quite carefully, but it's them that now needs to defend. So this is what could have happened in the game. Instead, bishop takes would have solidified the position, and in that same line that we were just looking at, bishop c5 is no longer an important move whatsoever, because you don't have the open f-file that you can exert pressure along. Okay, so after pawn takes, again, bishop takes was the important move. Pawn takes gave that counter chance, but unfortunately for Gukesh, he did not play bishop c5. He played queen to c2, and I think this was kind of the final moment where he had a chance back into the game, bishop c5. Although I don't blame him. Look at the time situation. Both players super low on time. 4 minutes now for Gukesh. You don't want to trade. Same reasoning as before. You're down a lot of material, and these are still permanent weaknesses. And after black castles, bishop to d4, trying to potentially put some pressure, activate the only pieces that they have, but it comes at the cost of the trade of the rooks. And again, you don't really want to trade down pieces now. Now, white has an extra bishop pair, which is useful, but they're down too much material. And these pawns are rolling down the board, you're taking on g4, the bishop is activating, the bishop is now coming to the center, and the more you trade, the better for black in this sort of position, up so much material. And finally, after queen takes a2, a check was given by Gukesh, but kind of just in spite, because after the king moves, Gukesh resigned down 3 pawns, and with a pretty dominating position. This a3 pawn specifically seems to be quite telling. Also, the weaknesses of this king are not something that I should neglect to mention. That is a pretty serious weakness, and nonetheless, I think, especially with the engine evaluation, it's understandable why Gukesh resigned. So big news, guys. Ding Liren is telling all of the people, and there were many who said that he has very little chance of survival. He's telling them to back off and watch him, because this was a solid performance. He pretty much made no mistakes, except for this one inaccuracy where he gave back the chance to his opponent when he took back on e6 with the pawn instead of the bishop. That was the only serious inaccuracy of the game. Ding seems in good style, and if this game is any indication of what's to come, then maybe we won't actually see the youngest ever world champion like so many, me included, first thought. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here, like the video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.